Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more of those, point your browser to bioscience.oxfordjournals.org. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Ted Kennedy, who's a research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey's Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center. He's here to talk to us about the way that hydroelectric power plants and a practice called hydropeaking can affect insect abundance and food webs downriver of dams. And we also get a chance to talk about the ways in which science might even help alleviate some of these effects. So let's get straight to the interview. Dr. Kennedy, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure.
So we're going to be talking a lot about hydropeaking today. So I wanted to get a rough idea of what that concept is. I think that's a good baseline for our listeners. What is hydropeaking and why is it done?
Right. So hydropeaking is the practice of bringing discharge levels in hydroelectric dams up and down over the course of a day. The reason this happens is because in the electrical grid, basically, it's impossible to store large amounts of energy, and so in the morning when people wake up, somewhere within the grid, an increase in electrical output has to occur, and so hydropower, dams, basically they can open up the penstocks, the gates that allow water to flow through the dam, and within seconds they can increase the output of electricity from the dam. But it's really, it's a function of society's needs for electricity, so yeah.
So you mentioned the artificial tides that this creates. Could you describe that a little bit? What's happening downstream of the dam when hydropeaking is practiced?
Right. So, what happens is, in Glen Canyon, at least, the discharge can vary by, up to 50% within a day. So over the course of hours, the discharge of the Colorado River goes up by 50% or more. And what ends up happening is you get these artificial tides. So these basically this up and down in the river levels at the dam leads to waves that propagate downstream. And in Grand Canyon, we think they propagate probably farther than they do in most systems because we have, canyon-bound river. We don't have any really big tributaries to come in and sort of buffer and ameliorate these waves. So what ends up happening is you get tides at all points downstream of the dam, and the timing of those tides ends up varying, depending on how far you are downstream.
Okay, and then, since this is a biology-based podcast, I'm assuming that this has something to do with, or some effect rather, on the biology of the river. What species does this have the greatest effect on?
Yeah. So what we're finding is that, these tides seem to be creating a life history bottleneck for aquatic insects in particular. There's been a lot of studies that have looked at how these tides might strand juvenile fishes, how they algae and other types of macrophytes have a hard time being in this intertidal zone. Tides are obviously a natural part of ocean settings, and those organisms evolved with these tides and adapted in response. But in rivers, it's a phenomenon that's totally unnatural. And what we're finding is that these tides seem to really negatively affect aquatic insects. Aquatic insects are a really important prey item for lots of fishes. They're kind of the cornerstone of river food webs, and so these tides seem to really they just make it so that many species of aquatic insects simply can't exist.
Okay, and you mentioned a life history bottleneck. At what stage of their life history are they hitting that bottleneck?
Yeah, it seems to be right at the start of the whole life cycle. So aquatic insects have complex life cycles, where the larvae, the egg larvae and pupae are aquatic and in the river. then the adults emerge from the river as winged terrestrial insects and mate, and quickly lay eggs back in the river. And it turns out that many aquatic insects, almost 80%, have egg-laying behaviors that are predicated on river edge habitats. So these sort of shallow places along river margins. And so when you impose this artificial intertidal zone, we're finding that many aquatic insects the eggs are just getting desiccated and leading to mortality and basically life history bottleneck, where they just can't get past that first life history stage, the egg stage.
Okay, so what they're relying on is they're essentially requiring very shallow water to lay their eggs in.
That's what I guess the majority of aquatic insects, nearly 80%, have egg-laying behaviors that are known as cementing, where they're crawling underwater and cementing their eggs onto rocks or vegetation, logs, things like that. And generally that would require somewhat shallow water. Essentially, there are some species of insects that can sort of crawl great distances underwater, a meter or two. But most of them, we think, are reliant on sort of shallow, quiet water habitat, and that just doesn't exist, or it does exist in these hydropeaking rivers, but these insects, they're kind of hardwired to emerge and lay eggs in the late afternoon, evening time frame, and they're laying eggs. They have this biological imperative to lay eggs. And they don't realize, right, that the water levels in this river are going to drop out by a meter in just a couple of hours, leaving eggs high and dry.
Okay, so essentially what's happening is these insects are the terrestrial adults. They need to be able to crawl into the water a little way to lay their eggs and cement them to some solid surface.
Exactly.
And they're laying their eggs instead under these hydropeaking circumstances at peak flow levels or near peak flow levels in the late evening or afternoon? Yep. And
then right, the tides go out and those eggs are left high and dry, and our team did some studies looking at the effects of brief desiccation on egg survival, and we found that basically anything over an hour, if eggs are exposed to air for an hour or more, you have almost complete mortality of those eggs.
And so instead of that, you're looking at overnight here.
Yeah, 12 hours. And, the experiments that we did looking at desiccation, that simulated one cycle. Insect eggs typically take days to weeks to hatch into larvae. And so, in a natural setting, eggs would be exposed to multiple drying cycles before they hatched. So the mortality estimates that we present in our paper, those should be viewed as conservative estimates that, in natural settings, we might expect actually much higher rates of mortality than we observed with just one simulated hydropeaking cycle.
And what was that mortality rate like?
Basically 99%. The values were indistinguishable from zero statistically. You couldn't tell them apart from zero. So basically complete mortality.
So you've got complete mortality, and that's the conservative estimate.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And then I guess the next logical question is, what effect do we see on the ecosystem from the loss of these insects? I'm assuming that this has a wider effect.
Well, we've actually shown some of the negative effects of low diversity invertebrate assemblages in Grand Canyon, and that's what really motivated our study. Aquatic insects tend to be really key prey items for fishes, for birds and bats. They have this biological imperative to drift. Drift is this term for when an insect enters the water column and is being transported downstream by the currents. Insects, have this imperative to drift at least a couple life stages after they hatch out of the egg stage. They're dispersing away from sort of their siblings, and so that's one point where they intentionally drift. And then another stage where they have to drift is often at the emergent stage. So, a pupal insect has transformed into an adult. That adult needs to get out of the water column and fly away essentially. And so, because of this imperative to drift at two different life stages, aquatic insects end up being really key prey items for fish. When they're drifting, that makes them more vulnerable to fish predation. And so, in our Grand Canyon food web studies, we found that aquatic, we only have two kinds of aquatic insects that are really common in Grand Canyon, midges and blackflies. Uh-huh. And it turned out that these two types of insects were really key prey items for native fishes throughout Grand Canyon. So the production of these insects was fairly low. The amount of biomass being produced per year was fairly low, but the fishes, things like endangered humpback chub and flannelmouth sucker, they were relying heavily on these two types of aquatic insects. And we actually found evidence that the fish populations themselves are limited by the availability of aquatic insect biomass, essentially. So does that make sense?
It does, yeah. So upstream, you're extirpating the insects with the high flows and then subsequent river level drops, and downstream you don't have the insect biomass that the fish need to prosper.
Yeah, pretty much. That basically the fishes are there. The amount of fish biomass seems to be constrained by the amount of insect biomass, and the BioScience paper demonstrates that both the abundance of things like midges, which we have in Grand Canyon, that is constrained by these hydropeaking waves. And then also there's a whole host of species that are gone from Grand Canyon that don't exist there anymore because they have egg-laying strategies that are particularly sensitive to hydropeaking waves. So essentially, getting back to your question, what effects might we expect in food webs? What we showed in Grand Canyon is that, because hydropeaking is constraining, it's creating this life history bottleneck for insects at this egg stage, that, the fishes themselves that are feeding on insects, that they're limited by the amount of insect biomass.
Okay. And before we move into, I want to talk a lot about the citizen science element of this.
Right.
But before we get into that, I was hoping just to give an idea of the scope of the study area. We're not talking about these effects occurring just beneath the dam. This is something that propagates throughout a long distance. How many miles of river are we talking about?
We're talking about 270 miles. Basically, you see hourly changes in the height of the Colorado River of around 3 feet, all the way down to where the river is entering the next reservoir, Lake Mead, which is formed by Hoover Dam. So huge, 270-mile stretch of river. We see these hydropeaking waves, and we see evidence that those waves, that artificial intertidal zone is constraining aquatic insects throughout that entire reach.
Okay, and I was hoping to talk then, again, as I mentioned, about the citizen science element of this.
Right.
What made this area particularly useful or good candidate for being studied in that way?
Right. Well, yeah. So it was really motivated by our earlier food web studies that I was talking about, where we have some really precious populations of native fish in Grand Canyon. Colorado River native fishes are not doing very well, and but in Grand Canyon that we have 4 species of native Colorado River fish, and those food web studies showed that these fish populations were being limited by invertebrate production, and so we started asking ourselves, well, why is invertebrate production so low? Why are there so few species of aquatic insects there? And I realized, to really get at that question, that we were going to need to start studying other life stages of aquatic insects. The food web studies that we had done, and really all the prior aquatic ecology investigations in Grand Canyon had looked at the larval life stage of insects, so that riverine life stage. And it hit me when I'm asking myself why don't we have mayflies in Grand Canyon, that we really need to look at the entire life cycle of an insect in the context of this this highly altered river to potentially answer that question. And so I was the available tools for studying adult life stages of aquatic insects, the available sort of methods and protocols, they just weren't going to work in a place like Grand Canyon, where it's just really hard to get to, right? There's only road access at the top near the dam, and then down at the very bottom end where you have Lake Mead. So, if you want to collect samples, you need to do a river trip through Grand Canyon. That takes about 2 weeks, and they cost a lot of money. Or you can hike in at various places. And so you can see with those sort of constraints that, the amount of data that you could get using traditional methods for sampling adult insects is going to be really limited. And basically, I was out taking a hike trying to wrestle with this problem. How are we going to study adult insects when we can't really get down there very often? And it hit me that, there's a whole, there's lots of people that are down there all the time, river guides, private boaters. And if we could just come up with a simple, repeatable sampling approach, we might be able to get a lot of data from this really remote ecosystem by collaborating with these citizen scientists. So that was the sort of the thought process there.
That makes sense. So, there's really no way to get to that river except for a long hike. You can't even take a 4x4 down there.
Nope. Yeah, absolutely not. And the river trips, that's one way to obviously get down there, but those trips cost a lot of money. And aquatic insects, the adult life stages, these emergent insects, they're famous for being really temporally variable, where you have these hatches, right? And they go off at various times. And so it's hard to predict. It would be hard to sort of plan river trips, enough river trips to catch all of these potential emergent insect hatches, essentially.
So the approach then is to design this protocol that can be carried out by citizen scientists, amateur scientists. And what was that protocol like? What were they doing?
Yeah, basically, each night in camp, having done, I've done 15 to 20 river trips myself, and I kind of had a feel for how those things go. And folks are camping at different places every night, and over the course of 2 weeks, they're making that 270-mile journey, but it. Basically, we just said, wherever you're camped, doesn't matter where you're camped, just put out this simple light trap each night. We gave them a table of sunset times, and they were instructed to put the trap out within an hour after sunset, nautical sunset, and then to leave the trap out for 1 hour. And to put the trap near the river's edge, essentially.
Okay, and how many samples did you collect, roughly?
With the help of these dedicated professional river guides and private boaters and education groups, we got over 2,500 samples in just 3 years. So it's, I believe, the largest data set of adult aquatic insects ever collected.
That's enormous, and you're able to use a large number of these samples. You're getting reasonably good data.
We're getting great data. Yeah, we have some figures in the paper that depict the data, and whenever I show these slides at meetings, I've heard the audience audibly gasp when they see the scope of the data and also the patterns that are emerging from these data.
So what are they telling you? What sort of trends are you seeing from those data? Do they match the predictions from your lab work?
Right. So what the data are showing is that the timing of these tides as you move through Grand Canyon, that is constraining aquatic insect production.
And moving from that very wide scope to an even wider one, these results are generalizable, aren't they? You see this result everywhere, right?
We do. Yeah, we see the same thing elsewhere. And we are interested in looking at other rivers now in other regions, throughout the U.S. and even throughout the world, to see, to further test the hypothesis. And one thing that's really exciting too is in Glen Canyon, at Glen Canyon Dam, there's an adaptive management program, where they're striving to basically, try and see if they can improve resource condition in Grand Canyon by making subtle tweaks to how the dam is operated. And so we've shared the results of our BioScience paper with the adaptive management program at Glen Canyon Dam, and they seem very receptive and interested in trying to mitigate these negative effects of hydropeaking on insect assemblages. And so it may be in a couple of years' time that they'll be doing flow experiments to try and mitigate those effects. So that'll be another sort of test of the hypothesis, like we were talking about.
And you've anticipated my next question, which is always that we identify a difficult problem and then wonder about how to fix it.
Right.
So obviously it would be wildly speculative at this point, but what sorts of flow changes could be conceived that might have the sort of positive effects on these insect assemblages? Is there anything that you have in mind right now?
Yeah. Well, yeah, the one that we've actually proposed and that's being considered as part of the ongoing environmental impact statement for Glen Canyon is, so this life history bottleneck that we identified, it's occurring at the egg stage. Aquatic insects can be really fecund and really prolific, with an individual female laying, hundreds to thousands of eggs. So, what we think is going on now in Grand Canyon and other hydropeaking rivers is, this hydropeaking occurs almost every day of the year. And so you have, 99% mortality of insect eggs that are laid along river edges. To mitigate that, you don't actually need to create ideal egg-laying conditions throughout the year. Again, these insects can be really prolific. It might be you just need to create ideal egg-laying conditions periodically throughout the emergent adult insect season. And so what we proposed is essentially having stable and low flows every weekend from May through August. On the weekends, this hydropeaking is not as valuable, essentially, because on weekends, right, you don't have factories and office buildings powering up and turning on AC, and so the changes in electricity demand on the weekend days are not as great, and so hydropower revenues tend to not to be as great either. And so, if you were to do these stable low flows on weekends, where you would not have an artificial tide on these weekends, you could create these ideal egg-laying conditions that the aquatic insects need, and you could also potentially minimally affect hydropower revenues and the important service that hydropower provides to society.
Right, and the insects are in that egg stage for a brief enough period of time that even just doing it for a day or two could potentially allow many of them to reach adulthood.
Potentially, we don't actually think that it's probably going to take longer than a weekend for the eggs to hatch. But you can imagine these tides where you have a high and a low tide during the weekdays. On the weekends, what we've proposed is that you would have the flow level at the low tide level, and so any eggs that were laid on the weekends would remain wetted and would never be exposed to desiccation, and they would give them the days to weeks that they need to hatch, essentially.
Got it. And one question I often ask is what I think of as the climate change question, which is there are obviously human effects in the river beyond simply those related to hydropeaking. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of those other stressors and the way they might interact with what we've talked about already.
Yeah. Well, I think, the big one that we may see is, the Lake Powell Reservoir, the reservoir upstream of Glen Canyon Dam. Climate change is predicted to lead to a hotter, drier climate here in the western U.S. You look across the globe, and there tends to be disagreement among these climate models. For certain regions, it's hard to get the precipitation pattern right, and different climate models predict different changes in precipitation for different regions. But in the western U.S., where we're working, basically every single climate model predicts hotter and drier.
Got it.
And so what what we're expecting to see is that over the coming decades, that the levels in Lake Powell Reservoir may get lower. There's been a lot of newspaper articles about how low water levels are in Lake Mead and Lake Powell, and we think that's probably the new normal. And so, what that's going to do to Grand Canyon is, where the dam withdraws water from the reservoir, it's deep within the reservoir.
Yeah.
And so the water tends to be cold throughout the year. And what we've seen in recent years as Lake Powell Reservoir gets lower is that the water temperatures have actually warmed a bit. And so the main climate change effect that we may see in Grand Canyon is essentially thermal regimes, temperature regimes that start getting warmer, and actually more similar to the undammed river. The thing is, though, the reason why I think it's important to try and get healthier insect assemblages in Grand Canyon is that temperature change, even though it's it's going to be maybe more like natural conditions, that's going to be a big change, a big environmental change, right?
Yeah.
When right in the first 3 or 4 decades of Glen Canyon Dam's existence, the water temperatures coming out of the dam have been pretty steady at 8 to 11 centigrade, and so in the last decade we've actually seen release temperatures of 16 degrees centigrade. That's a pretty big change in river temperatures, and so that stressor of new novel temperatures, could really affect food webs. And I think it's important to have resilient food webs that are stable, and so if we can work on sort of restoring invertebrate assemblages and getting a healthier river, it might mean that in the face of climate change, that we have a more resilient ecosystem, essentially.
Okay, and my last question is always the same one, which is, are there any things that you thought we'd talk about today that we haven't? What have we missed?
I guess one thing I haven't sort of talked about is how important, that aquatic insects, that they're important for river food webs, like we've been talking about. They support fish populations, but then when they emerge as winged adults, they're also they're key predators for things like birds, bats, and spiders. And so if we can get healthier, more diverse insect assemblages in the Colorado River, we expect to see larger, healthier fish populations, but we might also expect to see healthier riparian food webs where we have more species and more numbers of birds and bats and other sort of terrestrial wildlife that are reliant on these aquatic insects during the adult life stages. So, if we can improve the health of these insect assemblages, it could have really far-reaching effects, beyond the river into the terrestrial environment.
And that seems like a great note to leave it on. Dr. Kennedy, thank you very much for joining me today.
Hey, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.